Zidane, the most famous footballer in the world at that point, in Bangladesh, he didn't need to do that, right? 10, 12 years, roughly, I was like, hey, this is the job that every person would want to do forever, right? I was basically this graduate from sort of North-South in there, and then everyone else there was from, I don't know, LSE or Harvard, with my parents, with my to-be wife at that point as well, and, they were like, World Bank chakri chhede diba, right? And I had no clue, right? I had no prior kind of experience in managing something of this magnitude, and I couldn't sleep for a couple of nights. It was like,
hey guys, কি অবস্থা? আজকের গেস্টকে হি রিয়েলি ইজ দ্য ম্যান বিহাইন্ড দ্য সিনস। ওনার প্রোডাক্টকে আপনারা হয়তো বা ইউজ করেছেন অলরেডি। I know him very well. He's Qazi Zulquarnain bhai. He launched Uber in Bangladesh and currently uni director of Uber, the global company, and uni currently Netherlands based, and he's the director of global strategy and operation. We are very lucky to have him on the show today. আজকে আমরা অনেক কিছু নিয়ে কথা বলি from his early days as a sports journalist at the Daily Star all the way to his current role at Uber. মাঝখানে অনেক জায়গায় উনি কাজ করেছেন and ওই সবগুলো stories নিয়ে we talked about it. Before we dive in, I have to give you one or two disclaimers. Number one, this entire conversation is in English. আমি ক্ষমা চেয়ে নিচ্ছি because বাংলায় করলে I know অনেকজনের সুবিধা হয়। আমি এর আগেও চেষ্টা করেছিলাম সাবটাইটেলস দিতে, বাট অনেক কাজ and এটা করা I can't make promises. I will try my best. However, that is the case for now. Number two, we talked about Biznerd as a name for us. আমাদের এই কমিউনিটিটার জন্য একটা নাম। পডকাস্টের নাম আপাতত চেঞ্জ করছি না। What I am doing is restarting my newsletter. নিউজলেটারটার নাম এখন Biznerd হবে and we're going to analyze everything that's happening in technology and business. ব্যাপার হচ্ছে কি আমি অলরেডি এই নিউজগুলো হয়তো ফলো করতাম, 2 লাইন লিখতাম, ইউজুয়ালি মানুষজনকে খুব ক্লোজ সার্কেলে পাঠাইতাম। এই জিনিসটাই আমি এখন একটা নিউজলেটার as well as Facebook গ্রুপে শেয়ার করব। What's going to happen? I'm going to try this out. আমার নিউজলেটার অলরেডি অনেক সাবস্ক্রাইবার বসে আছে। I'm sorry আমি এতদিন কিছু লিখি নাই। ফেসবুক গ্রুপ একটা খুলতেছি। If you want, you can join it. আমি I think 100 জনের বা 50 জনের বেশি নিব না আসলে, just to see whether this is a good idea at all. If you want to, please join. আমি লিংক দিয়ে দিব and এই পুরো জিনিসটার নাম হবে Biznerd. Let's bring us back to today's conversation with Qazi Zulquarnain bhai, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already, please like, share and subscribe. Again, the thing is I cannot check whether আপনি লাইক শেয়ার সাবস্ক্রাইব করেছেন কিনা। আমার আশা হচ্ছে যে এই পডকাস্টটা আমি সময় শ্রম ব্যয় করে যে আদৌ এই জিনিসটা তৈরি করছি আপনার হয়তো উপকার হচ্ছে, and সেই উপকার হওয়ার কারণে আপনি হয়তোবা একটু ভালো মনে করে এই জিনিসটা একটু পডকাস্টটা সাপোর্ট করবেন by liking, sharing, subscribing. I can't check, but I'm hoping যে আমরা এই ট্রাস্টটা বিল্ড করেছি যাতে আমরা একে অপরকে সাপোর্ট করতে পারি। Zulquar bhai, it is so good to finally have you on. I've been trying to schedule this for a little bit of time, and it's just amazing to have you on. I want to get into a lot of the stuff you've done, but we usually start this show by asking the guests to introduce themselves, and it'd be great if you could kick us off by introducing yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Zulquar. I work at Uber. I've been at Uber almost 7 years now, which is a long time.
Yeah.
And currently I'm heading up operations for international businesses for some products like globally. So I'm based in Amsterdam. But before that I was in Uber in Bangladesh, and it was back at the time when Pathao and Uber were like working together, let's put it that way, to kind of grow the ride-sharing sector in Bangladesh. And it's been a very interesting and eventful journey in this last 6-7 years.
I want to ask you about the incredible work you've been doing with Uber, both in Bangladesh as, I guess, the country founder of this thing, if I put it that way, my words. But I want to start with something else, which is football. Because I know you're a very passionate football player, but also you're a former sports journalist who used to write for the Daily Star for quite a bit of time. I want to start with this book we have right over here, where you wrote a small chapter.
I wrote 3 small chapters actually.
Right. So one of which is the French Connection. Could you kind of, for the benefit of the audience, talk to us about what the French Connection article is about, and how did you come to write it? Were you there during that time, or what's it all about?
Yeah, no, for sure. So it was actually back in 2006, if I recall correctly, and at that point I was working at the Daily Star as a sports journalist, and it was this big French company called Danone. I don't know if you know about them, but they were basically trying to launch a product in Bangladesh. And they decided who better to come here and launch it than the greatest French person that every Bangladeshi will know. and that happened to be Zinedine Zidane, right? And which was quite intriguing because it was like a few months after Zidane's final appearance in the World Cup and his retirement game, where we all know what happened, and so his fame was at its peak. So for actually Bangladesh to be able to attract someone of his caliber to come here, even if it was for like a corporate shindig, to put it that way, was actually great, right? So it was actually, so me being a sports journalist at that time, it was a great opportunity to kind of be very close to the action to see how it all unfolded. And it was like a very interesting experience. Like I put it on the piece article as well, where at the press conference where Zidane was meeting the press for the first time, I happened to be there. It was a very unique set of people sitting there. There was these two guys from Danone who were like the country head and the regional head of Danone. Very standard fare. There was the head of the BFF who was like really happy that a big celebrity was here.
Football Federation.
Football Federation. And then there were basically Professor Yunus.
Okay.
Because Danone had a partnership with Grameen to launch this like yogurt, which I think it's still here. It's called Grameen Shakti yogurt or something. So that was actually when they were doing that. And then it was basically one other guy who I don't actually recall who it was, and then Zidane, right? So it was like a set of characters who would never be in the same room ever again.
Very eclectic,
very exactly. and like there was obviously all this big talk about Zidane coming here, going to reinvigorate football in Bangladesh, get everyone excited. And even then, I kind of knew that's not going to happen, right? But it was just for this moment of time, a brief interlude from the doldrums of Bangladeshi football, so to put it, right? And actually he was there, and I mean for me there was 3 days that he was there. I think 2 days he was there, and then 1 day like sort of back and forth. But it was very interesting to kind of observe someone of his caliber up close, right? And I was really privileged to have that opportunity. And the fun part was, what I actually took away from that whole thing was that Zidane was a really good sport, right? In general, like he always did more than he had to, because he felt that he was in a country where people were really revering him or looking up to him, and he was really willing to go that extra mile. And often you find all of these big celebrities, they're probably not that interested. They're probably like, acha ashlam, I'll just make this appearance, I'll pocket some money or whatever. But I actually really like the fact that there was this game put on in his honor, Oidin Ratebalai, and he could just have sat in the VIP stand and watched the game going on. But what he did was he kind of he was wearing cargo pants and like sneakers. He put on like a sort of jersey, shorts pore. He came out on the pitch. It was dew-filled pitch, so he was slipping here and there, but he was still doing it, right? And Zidane, the most famous footballer in the world at that point, in Bangladesh, he didn't need to do that, right? And then the next day he went to visit this I think orphanage in Naranganj. I forgot where it was exactly, but the kids were putting on a game in his honor, and he came out and played with them, right? And for me that's great sport, right? That shows that I would think I've seen a lot of people over my years as actually sort of like journalists, but not many of them would want to do exactly what he did, right? So which was always what impressed me most actually about him,
right?
And I think as I predicted at that time, nothing happened for Bangladeshi football. It's still I think even actually worse in some ways than it was back then. So, but it was a great moment, and like I said, the time I spent as a journalist really helped me. Gave me the privilege to observe a lot of these, sometimes super athletes up close. Zidane is one of them. A few others I've met also along the way. And
Messi in 2011.
Yeah, I met him as well. Messi.
You met Messi.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, like he was quiet, right? He didn't say much. He wasn't at the press conference, but I had the chance to kind of see him up close. Like another person I've always been super impressed by was Usain Bolt. I don't know if you know about Usain Bolt so much. I don't know if our audience does so much, but Usain Bolt for me is like the most electric athlete in the world. And I had the chance to kind of speak to him when he in actually London in 2012, when he was basically competing or trying to better what he did in like Beijing 4 years ago. And he won all of the 3 races he took part in, so he did a triple gold again.
Right.
And one of the things that stand out about that incident was how he took on pressure, how he managed pressure.
Because he was the winner for how many years? By that
point? So he actually has become the greatest ever, right? Because he's managed to win the 3 races that a racer of his of his capacity category like participates in, which is the 100 meter, 200 meter, and then the 4 into actually 100 meter like relay, right? These are the 3 races that he participates in. So he's won that in 3 consecutive games, Olympics, gold basically, and no one has ever done that because generally a sprinter's life is very it's quite short, right? It's not like, it's very hard to maintain that over 12 years, right? But he's managed to do that when he's completely the opposite of what science tells you a sprinter should be like. Generally sprinters should be kind of short and stocky because they have to generate pace. They have to generate that burst, exactly. Because it's 100 meters, it's very short, right? And he needs to basically so basically if you are short and stocky, then your center of gravity is lower to the ground and you can go faster. But Usain Bolt is like 6'4", and for him, like the first 30-40 sort of meters are very hard always because he can't get his feet sorted out well, right? Because he's so tall. So when he just goes from his sort of crouching like position to the sprinting sort of position, he needs to work it out, right? So over the 30-40 meters is always very slow. They're very slow by like, Olympic standards, of course. So he's always like you'll see like in actually almost all his like races, he completes like 30-40 meters, he's like 3rd or 4th, right? But then once he gets his legs sorted out, he can run so fast and his strides are so big that he basically he leaves pretty much everyone in the dust. And so like I think I read somewhere that he completes 100 meter in 40 steps, which is pretty insane. So he's basically doing about 2.5 meters per step, which is like 7 feet per step. So actually, if you look at it effectively, he's like flying. He's not even touching the ground basically, which is pretty crazy. Insane. But I think the thing that really impressed me about Usain Bolt was his real ability to kind of handle pressure, right? And it was best depicted by this thing he told me once, which was, like someone actually asked him, because he looks so chill, he's Caribbean, and he's got this, song and dance about him. He seems always chill. And then someone was like, hey, like, it's the eve of the biggest final, in your whole life. How do you actually get the pressure, handle pressure? He's like, and this one anecdote he said is like, he was standing on the gurney, like about to come out for the actual sort of race, and each person has this specific sort of volunteer assigned to them. So if they need anything, they'll give them that, right? So he was standing there, and the volunteer was like really nervous, right? And Usain Bolt was like, "Hey, are you okay?" And she was like, "No, I'm not okay," right? And then he spent like 5 minutes telling her it's gonna be okay and everything, and she came out and later said like, like I couldn't believe it that like it was his biggest race, but I was so nervous because I was assigned to him, and he was spending 5 minutes like calming me down, right? And that's like phenomenal ability to manage like pressure and stress, right, at that time. And and I think he told like when we actually asked him that, he said that he just trusts his preparation so much, right? He said what you guys don't see is like the amount of times I threw up while preparing for this. Like every day I would work so hard that I would throw up at the end of the day, right? And no one sees that because that's me training, on the side. So when I come, I know I'm well prepared, right? And so for me, that's also like, pretty kind of exceptional to see that, these great athletes, they put so much time and effort into doing things. But and I could talk about this stuff all day, so.
Clearly. You've been doing this for, 7 years?
No, actually 10 years. So I started at Daily Star as a contributor, but that was back in 2002 when I was just writing stuff for this defunct now publication called The Rising Stars. You might be too young.
I love Rising Stars.
That's good. And then
so I can't tell you how many times, maybe 5 or 6 actually, not many, that I've submitted stuff.
Oh really? Oh, amazing.
I wasn't that good. Class 1 in Chilam or something, but I
mean, come on, class 1, you're good. Trust me. No, it was interesting. So I started writing for them, and then I was writing this like sports column, and then the sports team was like, hey, like, do you want to come and work for us? And I was like, hey, this is a great opportunity. So then
How old were you then?
So when I started writing the Daily Star, I was 17 years old.
17 years.
Wow. So I was pretty young. I was pretty young, and I just started university. But it was like a good thing to do. I was very interested in it. And it was fun, and then that kind of morphed into a career for me, which was something. When I started, I never anticipated that it would be my career for like a decade almost. So I started roughly 2002, 2003, and I finished my Daily Start venture about 2012-13. So yeah, it was a while.
Yeah. What kept you there for that long? Because you studied economics at NSU, and before that you were at Scholastica. We're of the same alumni.
Oh yeah.
So it's not a typical career path.
No.
What made you stay?
Yeah, it's a good question. I often thought about that myself, right? And it was honestly my one principle that I feel that I've had in life is like, if I like something that I'm doing, I continue to do it. And if I don't like it, then I really suck at it. So I stop doing it, basically, right? So for me, it was like, I was really intrigued. And it didn't feel like work to me often, right? It felt like, I had this unique opportunity to really like attend all the sports games I ever wanted to, write about them.
Get at a candy store.
Like exactly that, right? It was for me like, oh, acha, mane khela hocche, I can watch it, I can write about it, I have the best seats in the stadium. Hey, what's not to like, right? It never felt like work. And for like, 10, 12 years, roughly, I was like, hey, this is the job that every person would want to do forever, right? Because if you like sports, if you like writing, and you combine those two things together, and I mean, that's the whole sort of principle I was speaking about. Like, if you really like something you do, it doesn't really feel like work, right? Like, so yeah, for me, it was just a fun interlude. University ho excited, I'm doing this. It was great. I can't complain.
So there are a couple of ways we can go. One is we can talk about the next chapter in your career, but I actually want to just take this chance to ask you about writing.
Yeah.
Because you spent 10 years as a journalist, you can't do that, and especially when you're writing to get published, which means every word that you write gets scrutinized and it gets edited and it gets tighter before you release. And 10 years of that, my God, that's like 10,000 hours of just doing really good writing. So what have you changed about your process, I guess, from when you started to when you left Daily Start, the 10 years that you were professionally writing? What are the things you picked up?
I sometimes, like, once I went back and I looked at some of the stuff I wrote back in 2003, and I feel like, oh man, who's this imbecile who's writing this stuff, right? It's actually funny because your writing evolves, like you said, as you kind of go through that process, day by day. When I started writing, I always felt like being able to write things. I was trying to be a little bit of a poseur, right? Like I was trying to posture. I know these words. I can write something really nicely. I can put a turn of phrase that's like 3 sentences long before it has a full stop or a comma. But after a while, you realize that writing the whole process and the purpose is to communicate effectively. At least as far as journalism is concerned, right? You want to be as succinct as possible. And succinct is really the word, because you want to be able to pack as much information and into as little words as you can, right? And that's a big change, right? You generally go from being someone who wants to write really long, flowery text to someone who wants to write very power-packed text in a very short way, but that communicates what you want to say as effectively as it can, right? So, and I think that was a good transition, because the world itself changed then as well, because we now talk about, I don't know, TikTok generation or the Instagram generation, where people's span of attention is much smaller. Effectively, my training at Daily Star helped me go down from writing something in 10 lines to writing that same thing in 2 lines, right?
Get to the punchline. One of the people we both know, Pardeep Rewal, like he was my former boss, he said something after sending a long email. He said, hey, I looked at the email and asked him, how long did it take you to write this? He said, very little time, that's why it's long. If I spent more time, it would be shorter.
It's true. It's a good way to put it. I think like as you move into more, again, I'm not saying that the art of long writing or flowery writing is kind of dead, but like as you move into like professions like journalism or professions that are more corporate in nature, the time or attention someone will give to the text you write is going to be much less than what it would be if they were reading fiction, right? Like you're a guy in your team will probably not want to read a 3-page long email because he'll be like, oh come on Fahad, why you send this, right? Whereas if it was fiction text, it would be probably fine. So I think also when you work in journalism, one of the things you notice is you're always constrained for space, right? Because you have only limited amount of space. So you're like, okay, 250 words on this, and then someone will be like, oh no, we only have room for 180. So you have to basically bring that 250 down to 180 without losing the essence of what you want to say. And that training for a decade really helps. So I think for me that was one of my biggest learnings.
So for the uninitiated, how would we get, in your opinion, how would we get our writing to be more to the point or succinct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think the way I tried to do it when I started was to first really break out what I wanted to say, right? Like, okay, what are the 3 or 4 things that I want to communicate? And those 3 or 4 things will each be 1 paragraph long, right? And I think for me that was like, okay, can I say this? So say for example, I was covering a cricket game, right? And it was like 5 big things happened in that game, right? And I would just summarize it in my head and be like, okay, these are the 5 things I want to start with that I want to actually sort of like put down, and then of those, how do I restructure it to be like most important first, second, third, fourth, fifth, right? So and then that really helped me because I was like constraining myself internally by saying, acha, ek paragraph beshi likhboi na, or ek paragraph should be 2 sentences long or maybe 3 sentences long. So if you put those constraints and you work within those constraints, tale koyekdin por dekhba it starts improving quite a bit. So that was actually definitely one thing that helped me a lot. Like defining a bound, right? I won't go. So then you automatically become. It was a bit like Twitter, right? Like when I first started using actually Twitter, it was like 180 character মধ্যে কি লিখবো মানে সম্ভবই না. And then after like I don't know a year of like using it, and I know Twitter is not very like popular here, but like এক বছর পরে I felt like, hey, I could put in a lot of stuff in 180 characters, right? And so it's a bit like that. That whole constraint factor really helps.
I'll go back to my former boss Deep. He also said, constraints breed creativity. This might have been an Uber maxim, by the way. I don't know. But
there are many Ubers stuff.
Okay, I could ask you about writing for the next hour, but for my own selfish purposes, but I'll stop. Tell us about what you did after Daily Star and how you kind of made that choice.
Yeah, so actually I also did something in parallel with Daily Star. So when I started Daily Star, like I said, I was in like university and it was almost like a side gig, help pay the bills, but also something I was interested in. But once I finished university, I was like, okay, I studied economics. I want to do something in that field. And my parents were like, you have to do something else, right? So I actually started working for that. I actually started working for the IFC.
Okay.
And I did that in parallel with the Daily Star for like, 5 years almost, right? And it was like IFC day job, Daily Star moonlight job, which was, again, also quite interesting because IFC was also kind of fun. It was also a very, very, high functioning environment. There was a lot of really smart people. I learned a ton from them. Like I was basically this graduate from sort of north-south in there, and then everyone else there was from, I don't know, LSE or Harvard. And I was often a bit intimidated. I was like, oh damn, like, these guys are smart. But then, after you spend a bit of time with them, you start to absorb a lot of their qualities and you see a bunch of what's happening. So again, that felt really interesting and intriguing to me.
And just so that everyone understands, like what are the so IFC is the International Finance Corporation. They typically work with
the private sector, and they're basically the private sector arm of the World Bank Group.
Private sector, okay, got it.
Yeah, so basically the World Bank generally will work with governments to help effect change in countries. Whereas the IFC would work with the private sector. So effectively, if you work with public and private, then
what are examples of projects, or just so people understand?
A bunch of stuff that I was working on was kind of investing in very high performing Bangladeshi textile factories or Bangladeshi garment factories, so that we help improve their corporate governance, we help improve their sort of operations, the way they think about sustainability. So to bring them to that next tier of like, okay, we're one of the top 10 factories in the world or stuff like that. So that was kind of one. Also working on agro supply chain to make sure you improve those things. So you're really investing in private sector backward linkages or forward actually linkages to make sure that the private sector functions as effectively. And then you're also fostering private-public dialogue to make sure that, private sector firms need some changes and you're actually able to sort of affect those changes by interfacing directly with actually their interests with the government and stuff, right? Or even like working with banks to give banks money for say green lending. So you're like, okay, I'll cover all these loans you want to give, but I'll give you this money. So out of this 100 million grant or whatever, you use 10 million deploy every year to finance some green factories or something like that, right? So these were some of the projects that we were working on, or like on like water, which is also like a very important thing now. Like garment factories are one of the big economic engines, but there's also a little bit of an outsized impact when it comes to social and environmental impacts as well. How can you actually lessen them and stuff? So I mean, it was also really intriguing work. Really up in the line of what I was what I had actually studied.
So 5 years there in parallel to the Daily Star. And I guess, because you're so passionate about what you're doing with the kid in the candy store at Daily Star, you're just not going to leave, even if it means like...
it was like, and after like 5 years, I was like, okay, I'm getting tired because my social life was shot because I was working from like 9 a.m. in the morning to like 11 p.m. at night because the Daily Star, I don't know if everyone knows this, but like usually if you're working in the daily paper, your work hours start at 5 and they end at 11 because you wait until the whole day is over, you collect the news, then you publish it, and it goes to the publisher around 12 or 1 at night. So basically your work hours are in the evening, and IFC was exactly the inverse, which was like a normal like work hours, which was 9 to 5. So it was like I finished at 5 and I would head over to Daily Star at 6, and then from 6 to 11 I would be at the Daily Star. And Daily Star was 6 days a week as well. So
18-hour days. Wow.
Yeah, pretty long days, right? But like I said, for a while it didn't feel like long days because the evening stuff felt like fun. The morning stuff also felt like fun. But after a while,
at this time, how old were you roughly?
So I started. I was 22. I was 22 when I started the IFC. It was.
Was it common to be? I don't know, working with IFC at 22? I don't know.
I mean, I wouldn't say it was super common. I was probably one of the youngest people there when I joined, and I joined as a consultant. So it was like a temporary gig to start off with, which then converted into a permanent gig. But it was often, it was like I said, when I went in there, I was sometimes a little bit intimidated because there were so many, highly qualified people. But if you're the youngest person in the chain, you get the opportunity to learn from everyone as well. And for me, that was also a great learning experience. And like I said, I really like to learn from other people. So for me, it was actually really nice to have that opportunity. And I got a lot of exposure. My managers there were really good. They trained me really well, and I'm always grateful to them. So
Daily Star, IFC, what next?
So I think this is, and then it became a little bit like a little bit of a crapshoot, so to put it, right? So I think I was at the Daily Star 5 years overlapping with IFC, and then I left because it was getting too much to do. 5 years of 9 to sort of
11,
11 was not that great, and so I was like, okay, what do I do now, right? And then I was like, okay, let me leave the Daily Star because at least from an economic perspective, I was well compensated enough that I could be like, okay, I can leave one of my jobs. But then, like to be fair, after a while, I started getting a little bored with the work I was doing at the IFC, right? And like I said, the only sort of principle I had was like, it has to be fun what I'm doing, right? And after a while, what happened was, IFC is great. Like you have a lot of collection of really smart people. They do some really impactful stuff, but you really rarely see, you're very far removed from the impact of what you're doing, right? And for me, that was always something that bothered me. Like, hey, we're really investing in this factory. We're also trying to help them, train them to do actually X, Y, Z. But I'm like 3 steps like removed from it because we're deploying someone to do that training. They're doing that training. That training is impacting some person there. And we'd write about all this stuff that we're doing. But I was like, man, come on. Like, I don't feel like I'm doing that personally, right? And then also like, by the nature of how that organization is, it's somewhat more slow moving than the real private sector. So you have, government sector or kind of World Bank group jobs. You have IFC, which moves a bit faster, and then you have the real private sector, which moves much faster, right? And I was like, hey, I want to do something that really, really, I feel like I'm moving the needle personally on certain things, right? And I feel like, hey, I'm still young enough that I can take that risk because. To be honest with you, like when I went and discussed that I was gonna leave sort of the like IFC, it wasn't a popular like decision with my parents, with my to-be wife at that point as well, and they were like, mane World Bank chakri chhede diba. And it was like because to be fair, honestly, like if I had stayed on at the World Bank, it can be like it can really evolve into a lifetime job pretty much, right? You can stay there until you retire, and it's great, honestly. Like I don't want to sound like I'm shitting on it a bit, but like the idea was like it was you could stay on there. And, like I had a brother, like a like a cousin of mine who was basically following that same track, and you could have a really great life, right? And my parents weren't very happy. No one was happy. But then I was like, hey, I'm still young enough, and I feel like I've done well enough that if I ever want to come back, I can. So
You're what, 27 or what?
So when I left IFC, I was 27 exactly. Yeah. So so then I was like, okay. 27, still young enough, and I can make that switch. And actually, I was 28. 28, and then I can still come back if I need to. I haven't burned any actually like here, like bridges here. The people here think highly of me. So
that's important, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's always important to be able to retain actually like relationships, and I still have relationships with a lot of the people who I used to work with back then. My manager, etc. Like I said, people I used to work or people who I learned from. I still feel like if I go back there now, it's going to be a warm kind of setting. And the same with the Daily Star. Whenever I come back, I'm always keen to kind of go back and visit people at the Daily Star or something like that, because I still feel I have a very it feels like home to me sometimes, right? So like at that point I was like, okay, I'm young enough to take a risk, and at that point internet in Bangladesh was just coming up. So this is 2013, and actually I actually started getting interested because IFC was one of the sort of early stage investors in GP, right? Okay. So Grameenphone, so IFC invested in Grameenphone in I think the 90s, and then basically they reinvested a bunch of money when Grameenphone wanted to go 3G, right? So this was back in 2011, 2012, and I think 3G came up early 2013. That was the if I have my math correct there. And the promise of what 3G could be was like so exciting. Like you could just build so many layers and so many businesses on top of what was happening there. And I actually read this paper, that we had actually published, and I was like, hey, this is where I need to work, right? Because this is interesting. We're going to build a new age of business on top of 3G. Bangladesh is really coming onto this era. And what do we want to do, etc. So that really got me started thinking about it, and then later I was like, okay, what is most exciting in this space, right? And then one of the things that kind of jumped up at me was a couple of friends of mine were starting with this company called like Rocket Internet at that point, and then essentially where you were basically like an incubator of sorts, where they would just give you full reins to kind of run an entire business end to end. Food Panda, which is one of the sort of largest companies here, got established out of that cohort. And they were also doing a little bit of like, basically they were betting on a number of like sort of verticals, or so to say, like industries, right? And one of them was e-commerce, right? And I was quite bullish about e-commerce because Bangladeshis, the two things we like doing are eating and shopping, right? So I was like, hey, eating is good, and so shopping needs to be next, right? So then they were spinning off this thing called Kaimu, and which was basically at that point, basically eBay-ish kind of site. I mean, I wouldn't say eBay. It was more like not a managed marketplace site, which to say that it was a consumer-to-consumer marketplace. That was how it was envisioned. Ended up becoming more of a B2C play as well, but a sort of SMB2C play, right? Small, which is essentially what you see all these F-commerce shops today. So these small businesses that are selling directly to consumers, could you bring them under one platform and actually, get really the consumer to purchase from you, right? So that was the principle.
If I'm not mistaken, like Daraz does part of their business in that way, right?
A large majority of their volume would definitely come from that. So I think I can tell you the story of how that happened, but. So at that point they were doing two things. So one is they were doing sort of Kaimu, which was one bet, where we're basically going to be like, hey, let's capture the long tail of sellers and the F-commerce players and stuff. And then the other play was, hey, we only sell really expensive stuff, and that was basically the Daraz play, right? So that was the two plays. And essentially the hypothesis then was, the Bangladesh market, 160 million people, it's going to be big enough for two of these players to exist, and you can have an C2C or SMB2C merchant and a large merchant with authentic stuff together operating effectively, right? That didn't turn out to be true at that point, but ultimately what happened was, what we then saw was the volumes being driven in terms of customers willing to come on the website and purchase things were much higher in Kemu, where basically because the average ticket size was very small. So and you know, it was really at the dawn of the internet age, so to speak, of in Bangladesh, right? No one really at that point had ever made online purchases, so to speak, of, right? So it was a big trust barrier that you had to like overcome, right? And effectively we were following kind of Say's law or Say's hypothesis, like supply will create its own thing, like. And so what we're doing, like, okay, let's get as many of these shoppers onto the platform as we possibly could. So I think it was a very interesting time to join Kemu. And, you know, I had this great role where I was going to head up, you know, all the seller stuff and everything. And I was like, okay, let's do this, right? So I kind of left my, you know, cushy, so to speak, interesting World Bank job, and then I was like, okay, let me do this now because this is kind of going to be a nice and interesting like adventure, and it actually turned out to be that way, right? And it was very, very intense, and so the culture of work was incredibly different. Like, you know, World Bank, super polished, very formal, the way you do things, to moving into a completely opposite startup where you're basically like, you know, working with people on the ground, trying to, you know, acquire a merchant from Newmarket and be like, hey, do you want to sell online? And they're like, what's online? And you're like, internet. They're like, internet? Yeah, I mean, yeah, like Facebook was still not as mass popular back then.
Right.
I mean, it started being like, actually, I remember one of the we did a survey from Game. It was quite interesting, where we were like, how many people use internet? And we found it was like, you know, we found that about 20% people said that they used internet, and then we said how many people have Facebook, and about 40% people said they had Facebook. So I was like, okay, that doesn't really work, right? So people are actually like using Facebook without knowing that they're consuming internet to like do so. So ওরকম মানে কিছু যে ইন্টারেস্টিং হাইপোথিস ছিল তখন, but for me it was really interesting. So it was like really going into these stores effectively with seller teams, trying to acquire these merchants and, you know, saying, hey bhai, Asen, come and sell on our platform. You know, you have to give us a fee if you sell, you have to deliver. So really just putting down the rails of what e-commerce would be like. So again, I felt quite privileged to be at the start of that journey and really see that evolve. And it was a very unique experience. Like I said, from a culture standpoint, from the type of work I was doing standpoint, it was very, very, very exciting and completely the opposite of what I was doing at the bank. And it was exactly what I wanted.
So two questions. One, because you were kind of the first person there, so to speak, I guess. I don't want to put...
No, I was not the first person there. So before... So I joined Kemu at a stage when we had just like acquired a bunch, but now the idea was to manage those effectively, get more... you know how C by R is a great metric that we use in our businesses in ride sharing, and then it's like that was called VTN. It was their version of
what is that?
It's called valid to net. So basically, it's like GMV to NMV, right? So basically, a lot of people would come in and order, but they would never complete the order if you call them. They'd be like, no, I was just testing and stuff. So because it was like the trust factor didn't exist yet. Right. So how do you make sure that, you know, consumer trust becomes higher and stuff?
And so just for the benefit of the audience, GMV means gross merchandise value, NMV means net merchandise value, and the difference is a lot of people order but don't end up completing it because they're just trying it out. Okay. Still being an early team member, I'm guessing you had to recruit a lot. You had to hire the earliest team members of that organization. What were some of the things that you look for in these, I guess, you know, founding team members, so to speak, of this new organization?
So I think to be completely transparent, I think a lot of my experience on recruiting happened in my next adventure, which I can come to in a bit. On this, what happened was I had actually joined the team when we were already about, you know, 20, 30 strong. And for a team at that point, for a startup at that point, 20, 30 was quite a big number. What I did do was I acquired a bunch of people on the sales function, right? Which were basically sales acquisition function, right? So because the only thing that was a principle for us at that point was to get as many sellers on the platform as we possibly could, and as many listings on the platform as we possibly could, right? So yeah, you know, I think the kind of people I was looking for there was really, really entrepreneurial people. I think that's the way I put it, right? People who
self-starters.
Self-starters, like people who are like, who would work well in an environment যেখানে তোমার structure and definition অনেক কম, and people who would be like, just can go out there, talk to someone and convince them to come on board. So like really the quality I was looking for was like if that person could convince someone to come on board, right? And effectively that worked quite well. But unfortunately my adventure Kemu was a little bit of the inverse of what you just actually described, because we learned that we scaled too fast, too quickly, right? Okay, and at some point there needed to be a rationalization. So actually one of my most I would say defining career moments was this one time when we had to lay off a lot of people. And that was,
I remember that. I knew a bunch of people at Kemu, and it was. I think the first time that a startup-ish organization in Bangladesh actually. One of the first time that I recall.
I think it was probably the first time, maybe. So that was actually one of the most brutal experiences of my professional career for sure, right? Like you go and you suddenly realize that. Because I came in slightly in the middle, and then I realized we're going too fast, and then funding was often not as you guys are probably familiar, readily sort of available, and then you need to make tough decisions, right? And I think I actually remember like when I really found out that we needed to do this, it was like, oh man, how's this gonna happen, right? And I had no clue, right? I had no prior kind of experience in managing something of this magnitude, and I couldn't sleep for a couple of nights. It was like, okay, how do I do this? I'm just doing stuff on an Excel and being like, okay, these teams are the teams that need to actually happen, but how do you make sure that you do that with the empathy that needs to be done, because you're really, really talking about people's lives here, right, and careers here. So that was really, really one of the big low moments of my career, I would say. But I think we. Again, I mean, I shouldn't speak for myself, but I think I still retain good relationships with a lot of people who were the team then and who we had to lay off, and I feel we managed to do it with some semblance of empathy, basically. But it was quite tough experience, right? And sometimes they had me questioning, hey, did I actually make the right decision? I probably wouldn't have been exposed to something like this. Right. But again, for me, it was like, hey, these are experiences that you'll have to go through, and not everything is going to be, sunshine and rainbows, and there will be stuff that will be tough to do, and I think those are what are more character defining. I mean, if you use a boomer kind of term, right? Do the really hard things, and that will define your character and stuff. But
I think Sequoia has a term for this. It's crucible moments.
Moments? Okay, I didn't know about that, but interesting.
So crucible moments are exactly character defining moments. In the moment of crisis, you kind of how you choose to act kind of defines what you're what you're made of. I want to ask you, so you go from World Bank, this prestigious job, to Kemu, which started with high hopes but ultimately didn't work. What were you thinking at that point when you had to, let's say, after the day you laid off a bunch of people, and you're now sitting there and thinking, what are you thinking, and how do you kind of overcome whatever you're thinking?
Honestly speaking, I was pretty down for a while. I think maybe even a week or 10 days, and I was really rethinking that, hey, whether this was the right kind of career move that I had made, because it wasn't pleasant, right, for me as well, right? And I think one of the most intriguing things for me then was it was bad for everyone, because there was a bunch of people we had to lay off, but there was a bunch of people who stayed, and sometimes if you looked at the people who stayed, some of them were like, why do we stay, right? And why did because they were friends with the people who had left, and Kemu was one of the first startups in Bangladesh where you had a really strong, decent team. They had built a togetherness. They were achieving something. We were acquiring sellers. People were actually buying online. So the hype was kind of quite high, and then suddenly you go from that high to that big down, and really trying to bring people back on a day-to-day basis. That was quite challenging for me. I was thinking that if I'm in a leadership position here, I definitely need to make sure that we keep the sort of morale still high, or if not high, at least at par, as though people can still come in and do their jobs and stuff. So I remember one of the things I did was have discussions with every team leader back then to see how their team was feeling. Try to do a bit more of team activities to try to get people reset or excited about the sort of mission that we were working towards, and the mission that had changed a bit, but also to be realistic, right? I know people were having a hard time, and we did have a lot of churn after that as well. People were like, okay, my job isn't really safe. And you know, that's something that you need to take as part for the course. But you know, just having an open ear, trying to listen to people, trying to talk to people, and really honestly being empathetic is the most important thing you can do in that situation, because there's not really anything you can say that will make things better for anyone. It's more like you need to be like, hey, I'm available, right? If you guys want to talk or something. So I think that was, you know, like again, for me, I didn't have really the sort of answers at that point of time. It was me trying to figure out how to deal with that kind of situation as well. And hopefully I won't face another situation like that. But if I do, then I know that I'm slightly better prepared than I was before, right? So
having gone through something like this, it's never easy. Oftentimes it feels like there are no right answers, but like you said, like I think it should be based on empathy, and you know, from there on out, like Uber. Uber in Bangladesh started roughly after that, I'd say in 2015. I think Wasif was, you know, he was former Pathao, and he was part of your early bandit of rebels who were, you know, trying to bring Uber to life. What was that journey like? How did you get involved? What were the early days?
It was. So I think I was still. So at that point, I was heading Kemu, and we were basically. We had come to the realization from a Rocket Group perspective that merging the Daraz and Kemu brands would be a better option across the sub-region, right? Largely because the hypothesis that we started with back in 2013, which was that, you know, 160 million people, 3G coming to everyone, internet would be big enough for everyone to have two separate marketplaces operating, one managed, one non-managed. It turned out to not be true, right? Roughly speaking, I actually still think it's not true, which is
which parts do you disagree with?
I think neither alone could be big enough to be a fully viable business, right?
So it has to be like hybrid.
Yeah, it has to be hybrid, right? So I think for me the part was we would drive a lot of volume, but the ticket sizes of that would be low, and the trust, like I said, the valid to net of that business would always be low, because it would be a bunch of new consumers coming onto the platform to test, and that would always be the loop, right? Like, so new customers coming into testing first few orders, not actually receiving them, but then, you know, building that trust to make small purchases, and then going forward to make bigger ones, right? So, and if you had two separate sites, that just didn't ever translate. If you had both of those things in the same site, then people were like, okay, I already trust this website, because you would have to build that trust again with someone else, right? And if Daraz was, you know, something where you're selling a TV, someone's not paying, I don't know, 20, 30K out of pocket on a site they never trust, right? So essentially bringing both of those things together would be the best option. And that's something, you know, I realized as well, like even maybe 2 years or like about a year and a half into this, that hey, like trying to do this together would be a much better way actually like forward. But often, you know, like you share that feedback up the chain, but often, you know, people up the chain don't actually like realize or see it. But then we had some visits, and you know, we really explained that, hey, I think managing these like together would be a better idea. So then I think
Uber.
So then I think it was actually at that time when we were trying to like complete the merge between Daraz and Kemu, try to make it one big part called Daraz Group, and essentially like, you know, migrate all our sellers onto their platform, etc. So yeah, it was a good time, and for me it was like I wasn't really looking for something at that point, because you know I was still very excited about the potential of e-commerce, and I still am in Bangladesh, and I was like, okay, we can manage this, and we can manage this together, and we can really grow and big. But at that point, like I was connected through a friend of mine with someone who was looking to launch like Bangladesh. His name was Utsav. I'm sure you guys know him as well. So Utsav and I randomly kind of met up through this common friend who connected us, because he just wanted to get some idea about businesses in Bangladesh. And that was kind of where it started. And I remember
wasn't Fahim, was it?
It wasn't Fahim. No, it wasn't Fahim. It was actually someone else. This guy called Adib. And so essentially, like we met for coffee. I actually remember it was at Lakeshore, and it was a work day, and you know, like the first thing Utsav said to me was, hey, why don't you come and like join us? And he's like a pretty straightforward guy, so he gets right to the point, going back to what we were discussing about being succinct, right?
Yeah.
And for me, it was a little bit of a left field request because, or like ask, right? Because for me, it was like, oh, I thought we were just discussing, you know, business as peers. And he was like, no, you got to come and actually like sort of like, yes, like join us. And I was like, is that, yeah. But then I got to start thinking, hey, like, do I want to do this? Because, you know, like I said, at KMU, when I joined, it was already like, you know, 20-30 people in the team. It was more like scaling an already started business versus starting something completely new from scratch, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, that is actually something that really appeals to me, right? It's something that is...
Paul Graham has this maxim kind of almost that, you know, the first 10 people you hire in your startup define the culture.
I think that's so true, right? That is 100% true. And I can come about it more in a bit. But like for me, it was like... Utsa was like, hey, we're just building out a team. We have 2 or 3 people now who are just like, you know, coming on, trying to help us understand the market, scope it out, etc. And we're going to launch Bangladesh in like, you know, 2 weeks or something. You know, why don't you come join us? And I think, if I remember, this was late 2015 or very early 2016 when we had this conversation, right? And I was like, hey, no, thanks. I'm like, you know, I'm fine. I'm doing well. I have a good actually like trajectory. I'm still very like motivated about this. So then about 2 months pass, and I'm like, oh, Uber hasn't launched in Bangladesh, right? So, and then he gets in touch again. He says, hey, like, you know, we're still looking for someone to do this. Do you want to come on board, etc. And I mean, at that point, I mean, what I was doing was just completing the KMU into Dara's transition, and I completed that. And like we managed to secure that everyone who was at KMU found a role at Dara's, etc. So I kind of felt like, you know, I'd reached a little bit of a natural conclusion. I could stay on there, and I could, you know, like the thing I had on the sort of table was to co-lead the business, etc., which would be quite exciting, and I think it would be fun to do. But then I was also like, hey, I always want to do something that I would start from scratch myself, right? And I didn't exactly have that opportunity. It was more like rationalizing or course correcting a lot what I was doing there. And I was like, okay, hey, maybe this is cool. So then, you know, that kicked off the whole Uber journey, and it was a really pivotal moment, to be honest with you. Like, I think for me, I was like, okay, I had navigated all the rough waters at Dara's KMU. We had a good kind of new vision that I was fully behind. I was pretty excited for the future of that business. And BRK, who kind of headed up the business, he's like super smart guy. He was quite bullish, and so I was like, okay, this is great. I want to do this. But then, you know, that little like seed, you know, that was planted about okay, kind of start something completely from scratch. And Uber at that point was like, you know, probably the hottest startup in the world as well, right? So
this
like
was
2015, early 2016, right?
Sure.
So it was definitely. They were basically raising capital everywhere. Travis was always in the news, and I was like, yeah, okay, maybe, So I think then that was the big leap, and I think I look back and I think that was probably one of the best decisions I made in my life, right? And it was not an easy decision. I remember that. I also like, you know, had a couple of sleepless nights over that decision, like, hey, should I do this, should I not do this? And I felt really bad about, you know, telling the team, because often, like I said, the team that I had kept after we had to sort of lay off all those people, we got really close, right? And we had to like relocate to a different office, a smaller place. So, you know, when you go through a lot of that sort of somewhat, let's say, like trauma with people together, and you experience and come through it together, you become very, very closely knit. But I was like, hey, I want to do this, right? And so broke it to the team, and then I was like, okay, this is going to be a new adventure, and I'm going to start completely from scratch. And like I said, it turned out, in hindsight, if I look back, I sometimes think that I should have done a lot of these things that I did a bit earlier. That's kind of my one, I would say, regret, right? Like you were asking me how old I was when I took certain decisions, and even now I think back to it, like, should I have left the IFC earlier? Should I have left the Daily Star earlier? Probably every time the answer that I come back to me in my mind is probably but you can't do everything right.
I've talked to a few people, and I've asked them what they would do differently. A lot of them have said, they've given me answers. A lot of them has said, hey, I do the same things just earlier.
Yeah, I think I agree
with less emotion. They also said that, but I don't know.
I don't particularly agree with the less emotion part. Like I said, I mean, for me, it's about liking something that I'm doing. If I like something, I'm already emotionally connected to it. And if I'm emotionally connected to it, the output I'm able to provide is always, I feel personally, much better. I mean, I don't subscribe to the theory of like being, I don't know, completely archetypally emotionless and take very, very difficult calls. Yes, that kind of mind space can help in certain situations for sure. But for me, if you really feel about something, your output towards that thing will always be better. That's my principle, or that's what I believe personally.
I would.
But I'm Bangladeshi, so I don't know if that's that's part of what's ingrained in our culture.
It's part of the code.
Yeah, part of the code.
I want to ask you more about your journey at Uber. But before that, I want to take a nice right turn and ask you about something I asked. So I know you're also an angel investor at this point, right? You also invest in a bunch of companies, and one of the companies is Shuttle. I asked Riyasat, who is a close friend of mine, about, hey, I'm talking to Zulquar soon. What should I ask him? And
I hope you didn't throw any difficult stuff in.
No. Hopefully not. No curveballs. One of the things he said is you recently became a father.
Yeah.
And I think you shared that, hey, this is really a special moment in my life, and it's something that I'm really enjoying. It's something very different. Could you kind of, for the audience, I guess, just tell us a bit about what this current phase of your life is like, and I'm sure you have many sleepless nights, but
that was definitely a curveball from him, Riyasat, because we were talking about his health kick, and I was talking about how I couldn't follow any of the health things I wanted to this year because I became a father. So I think he's definitely like rubbing that in. No, I think for me it was it was interesting because it's really learning something new. And one of the things that I thought about after I have my child, and we had them, we have him in Amsterdam, and like raising a child in that kind of context is somewhat different from raising a child here.
Right.
Like because here, if you're like fairly privileged enough, you're able to get support from your families, like your sort of in-laws, your own parents, and then sometimes you have domestic support staff at home who can help out, etc. Whereas there, it's all about doing everything on your own, right? And I think you have to dedicate like 100% of the child's time is split between you and your partner, right? And I think for me, that was that kind of time commitment was something that I thought about that we'd have to put, but when it actually came to the fore, I was like, okay, am I prepared for this? And it was a bit of a learning experience, and I was like, how do parents ever work, right? Like because I'm trying to learn how to calm a child. Like, why is he crying? Is he crying because of this or that? I don't have any clue. And it was kind of like a project almost, trying to figure out like how things are actually like sort of going. And then after 2-3 months you figure it out. So it's like it's a bit like a startup, right? In some ways, so to put it. I really hope my wife actually doesn't like hear this. but
at what point do you exit? When they turn 18, I guess.
Exactly. They exit. You don't. But then it's like they're basically you have to really learn this whole thing on your own, and you're really exposed to this. So at the same time, it's like probably the most defining experience of your life, where you have your own child, but it's also like, hey, I don't know anything about how to deal with this experience, right? So I feel like you kind of go through these 2-3 months of completely trying to figure everything out, and you're learning on the job pretty much, right? Like you're learning how to feed him while I don't know, cleaning his poop or something, right? So it's like it's very, very intense in that way, but it's also like 100% the most sort of rewarding thing you'll do, I think. And for me it's been quite an interesting time, just like because previously I'd come to the point where I had a really, really set structure about my professional life. I knew when I was going to work. I knew what was my home time. I knew what was my work time. I knew what was my health time. So like those buckets were very clearly structured and defined. And then you have something that like a sort of hurricane that throws all of those buckets out the door. And then you have to relearn how to put things into those buckets as effectively. So often I would have to do what I call a lot of context switching, right? Like I was like in a call talking about budgets and really looking into numbers, and the next minute I'm trying to, figure out why my baby is crying. So, that kind of context switching, and then the next minute I'm talking to someone on a one-on-one about, career aspirations. So there's a ton of context switching that needs to happen, and I think that was a skill that, I felt I was good at, but then I realized I was not as good as I thought I was, right? And so it's been quite interesting, and it's been quite rewarding, but also challenging at the same time. So I think I think it really shapes you, and I have a lot of respect for parents who have full-time jobs and are doing really well at it.
Coming back to Uber in Bangladesh, I know this is going kind of left, right, etc. But coming back to Uber, when you guys started, how did you think about it? I know Andrew Chen, who was at Uber, wrote an entire book with a lot of it based on Uber about how to start or how to solve the cold start problem, like a marketplace যখন শুরু করে কিভাবে মার্কেটপ্লেসটাকে আদৌ সাপ্লাই দিয়ে শুরু করা উচিত, i.e. the riders, নাকি demand, i.e. the passengers. So how did you guys think about it? I think Uber is also famous for playbooks. প্লেবুক মানে হচ্ছে কিভাবে জিনিসপাতি করা হয় সেটার একটা গো টু অর স্টেপ বাই স্টেপ গাইড। আপনারা কিভাবে এই জিনিসটাকে ট্যাকল করতেন?
I think the point you raised, যেটা হচ্ছে যে কোনটা দিয়ে শুরু করবা, is it going to be supply or is it going to be demand, right? And আমার প্রিন্সিপাল আমার এক্সপিরিয়েন্সের উপর বেস করা, সেটা হচ্ছে যে I said this a while earlier, এটা হচ্ছে যে there's this thing called Say's law, which is basically supply creates its own demand, right? So effectively তুমি যদি একটা জিনিস সাপ্লাই করতে পারো at a price point যেটা attractive enough, মানুষ will purchase it, right? And I think the way we looked at it, বাংলাদেশে আসার সময়, and I think you guys probably looked at the same way, পাঠাওতে, was that বাংলাদেশের রাস্তাঘাটে অনেক জ্যাম। বাংলাদেশের রাস্তাঘাটে জ্যাম is probably মানে the thing that people always think about, but তুমি যদি চিন্তা করো যে মানুষের যাতায়াতে কিন্তু অনেক সমস্যা। ধরো তুমি সন্ধ্যা বা বিকালবেলা যদি অফিস থেকে তুমি বেরো, তুমি তখন মানে ওই সময় আরও দেখতা যে মানুষজন রাস্তায় দাঁড়ায় আছে 10-20-30 জন, সবাই একটা সিএনজির জন্য ওয়েট, মানে ওই সিএনজি এসে বলতো যে আমি চাই 200 টাকা এখানে যেতে বা 300 টাকা এখানে যেতে। ওই সময় ওইটা অনেক অনেক মানে অনেক ছিল। তা তখন আমি দেখতাম যে আসলে মানুষের বাসায় যাতায়াত করার জন্য যে সহজ কোনো উপায় নেই। সো আমাদের অলওয়েজ হাইপোথিসিস ছিল যে ওই প্রবলেমটা যদি এরকম কোনো সলিউশন দেওয়া হয় ওদেরকে, মানুষ ওই সলিউশন দে উইল টেক। সো ডিমান্ড সাইডে যে এইখানে এই দামে কোনো রাইড দিলে মানুষ নিবে কিনা, আমাদের স্ট্রং হাইপোথিসিস ছিল অলওয়েজ যে এটা উইল ওয়ার্ক। অ্যান্ড দেন সাপ্লাই সাইড ওয়াজ দ্য বিগ চ্যালেঞ্জ, রাইট? যে বাংলাদেশে আসলে এরকম গাড়ি আছে কিনা যে এত গাড়ি যেখানে মানুষকে ঢুকাবে, মানুষ ওই গাড়ি করে এক জায়গা থেকে এক জায়গায় যাবে। তারপরে সেফটি সিকিউরিটি কনসার্ন আছে কিছু, যে ধরো মানুষজন একজন অচেনা লোকের গাড়িতে উঠবে কিনা। হ্যাঁ, অ্যান্ড আমার মনে আছে আমি যখন বলি মানুষকে যে উবার জয়েন করছি, সবাই আমাকে বলে যে এটা তো বাংলাদেশে কাজ হবে না কোনো সময়। হ্যাঁ, নট সেফ। হ্যাঁ, মানে যে এটা তো মানুষ কাজ হবে না। অনেক মানুষ আবার এটাও আমাকে করতে বলছে যে এটা তো হচ্ছে ওই কিছু কিছু লোক আছে, ড্রাইভার আছে, খ্যাপ নেয় অনেক, মানে এরকম ইয়ে হচ্ছে, লাইক ইয়ে হচ্ছে, এরকম ইয়ে হচ্ছে, ব্যবসা হচ্ছে। তা মানে I would say doubters or naysayers ছিল অনেক আর কি at that time, and they were all like যে জাম অনেক, সিকিউরিটি কনসার্ন অনেক, গাড়ির দাম অনেক, এই গাড়ি দিবে না কেউ। সো এরকম অনেকগুলো concerns were there, but I think the good thing যেটা আমাদের জন্য মানে what happened was যে আমরা যখন when I started trying to see যে গাড়ি কি আসলে পাওয়া যায় কিনা, the answer I found was যে there is অনেক গাড়ি, যেটা is তখন উবারের বিগ হাইপোথিসিস ছিল যে there is সব জায়গায় অনেক গাড়ি যেটা লাইক ইউটিলাইজেশন অনেক কম, মানে এটা ব্যবহার হয় খুব কম। সো ধরো একটা বাসায় একটা লোক একটা গাড়ি তোমার যদি মানে কিনে রাখে, ওই গাড়ির দাম অনেক, বাংলাদেশে গাড়ির দাম অনেক, ট্যাক্স অনেক। ওই গাড়ি কিনে সে খুব বেশি হলে ওই গাড়িটা মাসে 50 থেকে 60টা ট্রিপের জন্য ইটস অ্যাকচুয়ালি ইউজ। কারণ সে ধরো তুমি অফিস যায়, অফিস থেকে তোমার গিয়ে করে আসে, আর হয়তো উইকেন্ডে কোথাও যায়, বের হয় 1-2 জায়গায়, মাসে 30 দিন এভাবে। সো ধরো মাসে 20 দিন যায় হলো লাইক মানে 20 into 2 trips 40 trips অফিসে, আর বাকি উইকেন্ড ডেজে ধরো 8 to 16, সো তোমার 40 + 16 56 আর 4-5টা ট্রিপ এক্সট্রা, সো 60টা ট্রিপ করে মাসে। অ্যান্ড টোটাল টাইম ওই গাড়িটা মানে ব্যবহার হয় হচ্ছে ধরো 1 ঘন্টা ইচ ওয়ে, সো 65 আওয়ার্স, রাইট? সো বাকি টাইমটা কিন্তু গাড়িটা আন্ডার মানে ইটস দেয়ার, নো ওয়ানস ইউজিং ইট, রাইট? অ্যান্ড সেকেন্ড জিনিসটা হচ্ছে যে সব গাড়িরই মোটামুটি একজন চালক আছে, লাইক ড্রাইভার আছে, বিকজ খুব কম লোকই মোটামুটি নিজের চালায়। সো এই কারণে সো চালক আছে, গাড়ি আছে, এখন এটাকে যে কিভাবে করে দে ক্যান বি ইউজ ফর আদার পারপাসেস। সো এগেন আই ফেল্ট যে আমাদের ওইখানকার তোমার হাইপোথিসটা ওয়াজ ভেরি স্ট্রং, রাইট? সো যখন আমরা শুরু করি ফার্স্ট অবভিয়াসলি দ্য কোল্ড স্টার্ট প্রবলেম দ্যাট ইউ মেনশন, যে মানুষকে যে যখন বললাম যে উবার এরকম একটা জিনিস আপনার গাড়িটাকে দিবেন নাকি, অনেক মানুষ বলে আপনি উল্টা আমার সাথে আসেন, লাইক ব্যবসায় আসেন, হ্যাঁ আমি এই করবো ওই করবো এরকম। বাট আই থিঙ্ক মানে 3-4 উইক এরকম করার পর আই রিয়েলাইজ যে দের ইজ ওয়ান ক্যাটাগরি যেখানে মানুষজন এক্সাইটেড হবে আসার জন্য, সেটা হচ্ছে রেন্ট আ কার। সো বাংলাদেশের রেন্ট আ কার বিজনেস যদিও তখনকার সময় ইলিগাল ছিল, ইট ওয়াজ ডুইং ওয়েল, যে গাড়ি নিয়ে মানুষজন দিনের জন্য দৈনন্দিন গাড়ি বুক করে টু গো টু অ্যাকচুয়ালি সার্টেন থিংস এটসেট্রা। বাট এই গাড়িগুলো সেম হলো, জিনিস হলো ইউটিলাইজেশন অনেক কম ছিল। সো ওদেরকে যে বললাম আপনারা তো এই গাড়িতে ব্যবসায়ী মানে ইউ আর ডুইং অলরেডি, সো ওয়াই ডোন্ট ইউ কাইন্ড অফ স্টার্ট উইথ আস, অ্যান্ড দ্যাট কাইন্ড অফ স্টার্টেড টু বিকাম one of the best channels আমাদের জন্য to rent a car group. Cool. So I think ওখান থেকে then we realized যে আচ্ছা the supply thing is actually working, and then আমাদের একটা ছিল hypothesis ছিল যে এত নাম্বার গাড়ি দিলে will be fine, right? So ওইটা দিয়ে আমরা শুরু করি। So I think the number we had back then was যে 250টা গাড়ি যখন আমাদের will have, then we'll start. হ্যাঁ, তা আমরা 250টা গাড়ি দিয়ে we started on our first day, and I still remember যে one of the guys who was managing all of this called me and said যে ভাইয়া সবাই বলতেছে যে এই উবার সিস্টেমটা অফ করে দেওয়া যায় কিনা। আমি বললাম কেন? বলে যে ভাইয়া সব গাড়িতে এত আসতেছে মানে পিং যে ওরা একটা ছেড়ে আরেকটা ট্রিপ নিতে পারতেছে না। and then I knew যে our actual hypothesis on the demand side was right, because ওরা মানে because the big fear যে রেন্ট কার গাড়িগুলো ছিল সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা তো ট্রিপই কোনো সময় ইয়ে করবো না, পাবো না, আপনি যে আমাদের বলতেছেন ট্রিপই আমাদের ইয়ে করবে না, won't come, and first day they realized যে আসলে এত ট্রিপ আসবে যে মানে they can't manage it themselves. So then became completely a supply side game আর কি, হ্যাঁ, যে how do you make sure যে you get enough cars to fulfill that like demand basically. So that was kind of the start of the Uber journey. So to speak.
No, that's fantastic. Zulquar bhai, we're kind of cut for time, short on time today. I usually end by asking the same question to everyone, which is there a maxim that you live your life by, or is there a quote or something that that keeps coming to your mind? Again, this I know it doesn't always work, but I wanted to try it nonetheless.
No, I think it's the same thing I told you at the start of the conversation, right? You have to really enjoy what you're doing. So I think for me, like life's too short to not enjoy what you're doing, right? So like if you're gonna spend a ton of that time like working, right? Like you spend 8 hours a day like working. That's probably your single largest commitment apart from your family.
Right.
And if you don't enjoy what you do for 8 hours of day, then I don't think it's worth doing basically, right? So for me, my whole principle is always like, hey, this seems cool, or hey, this seems fun, right? And as long as something seems fun and cool, you should continue to kind of do that. But if it doesn't, I think you can try to find other things. And it's not about like privilege or other things. It's about like, for me, it's a fundamental principle. যে ধরো মানে anyone working any job should want to do or like be a bit more engaged in that job, or do something they like doing. Otherwise, there's always other things you can find that is probably at the same level or something that you will also kind of enjoy more. And I think for me, that's the one principle that I want to live by always.
Steve Jobs said something along the lines of work is going to fill a large part of your life.
Oh, he did?
If you, actually, he did. Work is going to fill a large part of your life. The only way to do great work is to do work that you love, and the only way to find what you love is to keep pushing. Don't settle. Something along those lines. I can't exactly.
Steve Jobs is a smart man. What can I say?
Clearly, you're in good company when it comes to maxims. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you so much.
And I hope to do a round 2, hopefully.
Yeah, sure. Sometime, maybe on Zoom.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.